I'm Carol Peters, and I am proud to serve as the president and CEO of United Way Next. I am excited for today's session because I love podcasts and was so grateful that Terry Tolan brought to us, as part of our Engage and Exchange work group committee, this topic and this wonderful resource. So today we have with us Laura Ellis, who is our guest speaker, and she represents the Louisville Public Media Podcast Incubator. And so welcome, Laura. And I'm going to just turn it over to Laura. We are recording the session, and for those who are not participating, it's a two-part workshop. The goal today is that after we go through this first part, we'll be inspired to say yes to wanting to create a podcast and continue forward. So Laura, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for having me. And thanks y'all for being here today to talk through podcasts a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see my slides here. Can everybody see that? Excellent. Okay. So I'm Laura Ellis. I'm in Louisville, Kentucky. I have been working in audio for about 20 years and in podcasting specifically for 12 years. Currently, I run a podcast incubator, and I'm the director of podcasts for a public media organization, basically public radio, a couple of public radio stations that are partnered together here in Louisville. And we make a bunch of podcasts. We help people make podcasts. We help people develop their podcasts and refine their ideas for podcasting. So I think we're going to do some of that today for y'all. This training session is designed to basically help you figure out whether it's a good idea for you or for your organization. We will talk about some good reasons and bad reasons to get into podcasting. And we'll talk about, if you decide to give it a go, how to give yourself the best shot at sustainability. Whether you have a big team, a small team, big budget, small budget, we're going to talk about like the different menu options that can make things a lighter lift, a heavier lift. My goal with this training is not to say, yes, everyone should start a podcast. And it's also not to say, run away, never start a podcast. It is to say, I want you to leave here with a realistic idea of what's involved in podcasting and basically help you figure out if the juice would be worth the squeeze for you and for your team and your organization. And then like share some strategies for defining success and reaching success. We are going to do that by asking a lot of questions. That's Lamar. He has a lot of questions all the time. This session will probably leave you with more questions than answers. And in part 2, which is going to happen November 1st, you'll come back with some answers that you've worked on in the interim, and then we'll workshop some of those ideas and refine them. In today's session, I'm going to try to remember to pause frequently for questions, but I do want you to just raise your hand and chime in anytime. We have a pretty small group, so I think we can just sort of unmute and chime in with questions or put them in the chat. And if I don't see, can one of our United Way folks like alert me if there's something in the chat if I'm not seeing it, because like the screen share thing is weird.
Absolutely.
Excellent. I want to start out with a little poll, if Caitlin's ready with our first poll, just to sort of get a sense of your familiarity with podcasts as a listener. So if you will take a second to answer these questions. Okay, excellent. This is basically a good starting point for you to think about when your potential folks might listen to podcasts, how often, and what they might also be doing while they're listening. So we have some sporadic listeners, got a couple of daily listeners. I'm a daily listener myself, of course. Commuting is a big thing we're doing while listening. I also listen to podcasts when I fall asleep. but only ones that I've listened to before. It's like putting on reruns of Frasier or something. You already know what's going to happen, so you can still fall asleep. Okay, would anybody who said none of these, would you be willing to share when you're listening, what you're doing when you're listening to podcasts? Are they able to unmute themselves, or do we have to unmute them?
They can unmute themselves.
Okay, they're just being shy. Okay, that's fine. We'll move on. Thank you all for indulging me in this poll. Let us move on to our first question. I can get rid of this poll, which is why. Why even podcasts? This is like the big one. So we're getting this one out of the way early, because it may be that you get through this section and go, you know what? No, thanks. If you're in this session, you must at least be considering that it might be right for you. And we're going to start with some bad reasons, both because there are more bad reasons than good reasons, and because they are funnier. Does anybody want to like hazard a guess at some of the bad reasons that I have heard people say they want to start a podcast? I have my list and they're all true. They're all from real life, but I'm interested in what you all think they might be.
As a revenue driver?
And it's definitely high on my list of bad reasons.
Just to promote an idea that they want everybody else to agree with.
Yeah, that's also on my list. Y'all are killing it. Okay, first of all, this is a lot of people's first answer. Why not? I mean, we might as well. We're talking anyway, right? We might as well record it and put it out as a podcast. To promote the work we do, which I think, was it Barbara who said that? So this is called a commercial, and people skip commercials on purpose. Nobody is probably going to seek one out that's half an hour to 45 minutes long to listen to. I think there are ways to, spotlight some things that you do in a podcast, but that can't be the main reason, and it can't be the main content, or no one's probably going to listen to it. Everybody else has one. Our competitor has one. We feel like we should be in this space too, even though we're really not sure what to say in it. Not a great reason. I've heard this 2 or 3 times now. Our board is asking, why don't we have a podcast? And so can you help us make one? And then I say, like, okay, what do you want it to be about? And they're like, oh, the thing up there to promote the work we do. It's like a circular thing. To bring in revenue is a big one. And it won't bring in revenue. I mean, it might eventually, if you're like a celebrity, or if you have a celebrity host, or in some way you become famous, but more than likely it's not going to be a revenue driver. If you're lucky, you might break even on it eventually. So that is on our list of bad reasons. Everybody says I'd be good at it. This is along the lines of, like, my mom thinks I'm funny. Everybody thinks we're so funny when we get together and just talk around the kitchen table. Surely it would be a great podcast. Probably not. So now let's move on to some good reasons. And I want to see if you have any guesses about good reasons to start a podcast. It's harder to come up with the good ones than the bad ones, to be honest with you. So this is not an exhaustive list. There are lots of good reasons to start a podcast. But this is just some of them to get you thinking. People in your community need to talk about something, and there's no existing forum for it. So my example for this is a podcast that we produced through our podcast incubator called Where Y'all Really From? And it focuses on the lives and stories of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Kentucky. Now, this came out of a few years ago. A man shot and killed several Asian American women in Atlanta. And it sparked conversations in our community about the experience of being an AAPI person in the South. But the conversations were sort of happening in pockets, like a one-off episode of a talk show, or like a really popular Facebook post that got a lot of engagement. there was no larger platform to sort of unite folks to have these conversations. So that's an example of how a podcast can serve this need for conversation that doesn't have any other home. You have a story to tell with lots of recorded audio. So like you've done a lot of interviews, or you've done an oral history project and it's audio tape, or you happen to have been recording when a really important event happened, or a really major press conference, or like a huge protest that was like a turning point for your city. Something where you have tape, like, and it's told best in sound is a good reason to do a podcast. To amplify voices of people that have been marginalized and ignored. This is why we do our podcast Incubator, specifically at Louisville Public Media. And I think that it is, it's something that as like mission-based, nonprofit-minded, community-centered people is probably one of the big reasons why we get into podcasting. We recognize also that like not every story is ours to tell, and not every conversation is necessarily ours to host. And so this is where we get into the idea of like partnering with folks in our community who are doing those things, having those conversations, and giving them a platform through our expertise and through our network. Building community, making people feel less alone. This is, again, the model of the Asian Americans in Kentucky podcast that I mentioned. The census data shows there's something like 75,000 Asian American and Pacific Islanders living in Kentucky. But unless they live in the two bigger cities, there's a good chance they're living in a rural location and feeling kind of isolated and not realizing how not alone they are. Like there are 75,000 other people who can probably relate to a lot of what they're saying. So a podcast is a chance to build community. And I always encourage you, once you get to the point, if you get to this point of thinking about building an audience, think about building a community. That's what podcasting can do very well. Or you have unique access to a person or conversation. Somebody in your community has a great story and they only want to tell it with you. That's probably a good reason. Oh, and here's my last one. There's a problem you can help solve, or a void you can fill. So a lot of times when people come to me and say like, I have an idea for a podcast, here's what it is. One of my first questions is, who's asking for this? Is it just you think it would be cool and fun to do? Or like, are people actually needing this? And then it's not to say you can't do one just for fun for yourself. We're going to talk later about what does success look like. And maybe success is you have a great time. But this is something worth thinking about. Because if you have a great answer to this question, it can really sharpen your end product. All right, moving on to our next question. What? This is your content. This is your idea. You need it to be unique. You need it to be something that not anyone else is doing yet. Or if it is like a similar topic, you want to have something that sets yours apart. Maybe that's you. Maybe you've had unique experiences that nobody else in this world has had, or very few people have had. Think about what's going to set your show apart from other shows in your genre and in your, similar subject matter. You don't want it to be too broad. You want it to be something that other people are likely to relate to. So I'll give you an example of this. A woman that I've worked with before, her name is Ilona. She works in finance. Like a lot of other people, when COVID hit, her work life got totally turned upside down. And she thought, maybe I should take this like sort of downtime and experiment with podcasting. So working in finance, she looked around and she saw a Blue Million podcast about personal finance, financial investments, investment portfolios, how to get out of debt. It's a very saturated space in podcasting. And so she knew that if she was just going to throw up a personal finance podcast, she would already be at a disadvantage because there's other people who have been doing it with more money for longer, who already have an audience. So she came up with an idea that I think is pretty brilliant, which is each episode of her podcast is called Money Memories. They're about 5 minutes long. It's a real bite-sized listen. And she asked each one of her guests, what is your earliest or most impactful memory about money? That's a question that every one of us could answer. It's super accessible. So even if I'm not a person who would normally be interested in a podcast about finance, I automatically have a hook. I can relate to it. And she uses that question to explore how those early money memories shape our later decisions around spending and why we might make financial decisions that don't make a lot of sense to other people. Because of what we remember from our earliest times relating to money. So that's just one example of like taking a huge, broad topic and figuring out how to make it both well-defined and very accessible to everybody. Think about what you're uniquely qualified to talk about. What can you do that nobody else can do? What can you do in a different way than anybody else can? We're going to get way more into vetting of your ideas in part 2 of this training, but this is just sort of to get you started thinking about how to formulate these ideas and how to develop them. Does anybody have any questions so far? I'm just really proud that I remembered to pause and ask for questions because I usually don't. Okay, now we're going to talk about who. Who are you making this for? And a lot of pitches that I get will say, well, for everybody, there's going to be something in this that everybody could find useful. If you're not making your show for any one person, you're not making your show for anyone. You're going to do yourself a disservice if you don't take some time and think about your audience. Now, I know that can be hard because it's like, well, I don't know. Like, I haven't made it yet. I have no idea who's going to like it. So instead of thinking in broad terms like, who might find something useful in this, I find it helpful to think like, who might be a super fan of this show? Like, what kind of person? Maybe it's somebody that I know. It could be a fictional character on a sitcom. It could be an imaginary person, but what sort of person would be excited every Wednesday because they know your show's coming out? What kind of person would buy your t-shirt and wear it? What kind of person is going to share your episodes and talk about them at the soccer game and say, like, you have to listen to this podcast. It's amazing. Think about who would be your super fan and then think more about that person. So those questions that we answered for ourselves about when we listen, how often we listen, what else we're doing while we're listening, think about that for your super fan. Like, does she listen as soon as it comes out, or does she save it up and binge it? What else is she doing while she's listening? What other media does she consume? Like, is she a vast podcast listener and listens to a lot of things, or is yours like one of the only ones and she's normally more of like a magazine reader or blog reader, a newsletter subscriber? Thinking about stuff like that will give you a better idea of who you are making it for. And also, when you get to that point, it'll give you a better idea of where you might want to market it, where you might want to pitch yourself. Like, if your typical super fan is a person who subscribes to all of the community and city newsletters, then you want to make sure you're advertising in community newsletters, for example. It's just a way to start thinking about who these folks are and how you can eventually reach them. Now, I want to give you an example that's a little vulnerable because it is something that we sort of didn't get right at first in my shop, and that is, you have to make sure the person you're creating this content for is also the person who's being reached by it. And what I mean by that is we had a political podcast that was basically a weekly news roundup of what had happened that week in state politics. The people who are going to seek out and subscribe to a podcast like that are super wonky people who love to follow state politics. They're definitely like news junkies. They are like, they know what the names of all the House bills are and where they are in the process of being passed or being vetoed. And these are not the type of people who need a roundup, because they've been following political news all week, because they follow all the people on Twitter and on Instagram, and they get news alerts about state house politics. We were making something that was appealing to people who did not actually need the thing that we were making. And so I share that just to give you an example of the person you're making the stuff for might not be the type of person who's seeking it out. It's just a pitfall to watch out for. And our solution to that was to sort of reinvent the show and make it more of a deep dive into something so that we're not recapping, we're actually furthering the conversation that the people have been listening to events about all week. It's just important to think about how those things match and who's consuming it and who it's for. All right, now it's almost time for another poll. I want to give Caitlin a heads up. Now we're going to talk about how, which I know is a thing that stresses people out a lot. We're going to get into some nitty gritty questions about format and frequency of episodes. This is really important because your answers to these questions will determine how big of a workload this is. And whether it's sustainable in the long term or whether you are sort of setting yourself and your team up for burnout. So let's do our next poll. This is our last poll. No other polls after this. For this poll, I want you to think about a podcast that you love. Maybe your favorite, one of your favorite podcasts. And think about how often it releases a new episode. Think about how long each episode is. And think about what the format is. So is it like Serial, where it unfolds a story over a season? Like it's a narrative? Is it like what they call a chat cast, which is kind of conversational in nature? There are people who are very devoted to fictional podcasts that are like portrayed by actors and they're all scripted. So let me take a look and see where we're landing on these things. I really love that people are checking this last option on the first question because that was totally just something I suspected, but didn't know whether people actually listen like that or not. I think a lot of us do just go, oh, I want to open up my podcast app and there's a new episode of the show I like. Awesome. These are just questions to get you thinking about the different sort of menu options that we have in podcasting. Okay, I think we're all in here. Thank you all for answering these. I think you all can see these results. Can you? Can you see the results as they come in? Or can I just see them?
There we go. We can see them now.
Okay, excellent. So we're seeing that most people are listening to either a serial type of thing or a chat cast. Okay, we're seeing a lot of shows between 15 and an hour. It's pretty typical. One of y'all is real devoted to a podcast that's over an hour long each episode. That's awesome. And then got a lot of weekly podcasts and a couple of seasonal ones. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to show you something now that I think we're probably all familiar with. Good, fast, and cheap, and you can only pick two. We've all heard this before, and it is very true in podcasting. I get a lot of pitches saying like, I want to start a weekly podcast about X. And I'm like, okay, great. Weekly for how long? And they're like, just weekly, just every week, all the time. That's a very popular format. And it is very hard to sustain if you don't have a team. Like if you don't have a team whose job it is to make a weekly podcast, it's really tough. It's more than you think, quite frankly, I think. So for the purposes of this session, we're going to assume that one of the options you picked is good because there are a whole lot of really great podcasts out there that nobody listens to. So if you're not at least picking good, we're probably in trouble from the outset. If you have any chance at all, I'm going to encourage you to pick that one. If you have a lot of money, if you have a budget, you got a huge grant, or if you have like a team of people that you need to assign work to somehow that don't have enough to do, then you can probably also pick fast. And if you have a small team and they all have other responsibilities and you're trying to figure out how to make this work alongside a lot of other stuff that you already have to do, and you can't hire more people, then you're probably going to pick cheap. So this is something that you should be thinking about as you design the processes of your show, because the processes are just as important to think about as the content. Because a lot of folks go into this with huge intentions and then they burn out. And it's like public because you've made this huge announcement that you've got this podcast and you're under pressure now to make one every week. And you're like ready to take a vacation. So for a weekly podcast, you can expect to spend, on the conservative side, 40 to 60 hours a week making that. And for a lot of shops, that looks like a producer who doubles as the host, and then also another person who's acting as a producer. This is not the only way to do it. But if you are trying to spend less time on it, you're going to sacrifice one of these other circles. Or you might get burned out and quit. We're going to talk really quickly about why does it take so long to make, why does it take so many staff hours to make what sounds like people sitting around talking. If you have any experience with podcasting already, you're going to already know this, but this is not real. This is totally fake and made up. And it is a very common misconception about podcasting. Let's look at the real one. This is a list that my team uses, like a checklist of things that we have to do for every episode of a podcast that we make. This doesn't include any of the sort of startup tasks, like finding a logo, finding music, naming your show, setting up your RSS feed. We're going to talk about all those in the next section, because those are things you only need to think about if you're like, yes, this is a yes for me. This is what it takes to make an episode. As you're looking at these, you're probably going to also notice that these are not all things that are going to happen in the week leading up to the episode's publication. So this is like a situation where in any given week, you might have a couple of episodes in like the planning and research phase. You might have some in the booking phase where you're doing the scheduling tango with guests that you're trying to get. You might have some shows that are in the interview prep phase where you're writing your questions. Some are probably being edited. Some probably just came out and you're trying to push them on social media. It's like it's like a bunch of mini projects, like a project every week, and every project is in a different phase of production. This is part of why it takes a lot longer than you think it does. There are also some things on here that aren't 100% necessary. So I wonder if you, if anybody wants to like name some of these things that they think might not totally be necessary. I mean, selling ads is one, right?
Yeah, that was going to be mine.
I'm curious about artwork because I think of podcasts as something you listen to. So
some shows will put a photo of their guest as the little logo for each episode, so that when you open it up in the feed, you can be like, oh, it's a new one. Or you can be like, oh, I recognize that person. They're kind of famous in my town. I'm going to listen to it. Now, that's a great example of one that's not necessary, because if you don't, it defaults to your logo, your just general logo. That's like what I think of as like a would be nice. It's kind of cool. It might get some eyeballs on you in the feed, but it's not totally necessary. If you don't have ads, you don't have to insert ad breaks. You might not send out an episode to your mailing list. You might have a mailing list. You might sort of not have time to share it with the guests. That's kind of unfortunate because they can be your ambassadors for that episode, but you know, maybe you don't. Like some things have to give sometimes. You get busy. So this is the list. I mean, some of these things are just things that you have to do. There are ways, though, to make the lift lighter. And that's what I want to talk about next, because I know this is like a lot. There are ways to make this work for your team. So one of them is, if you do long interviews, think about breaking them up into multiple episodes. That way you only have to do that booking, that recording, the question writing, and the interview prep stuff once, and you get 2 episodes out of it. It's going to mean you're going to write 2 different intros and outros. That's easier than doing 2 separate interviews. So if you're a person whose interviews tend to be pretty long and mostly keepable, this is probably a good option for you to get sort of 2 episodes for not the price of one, but the price of, like, buy one, get one 50% off, we'll say. Interview prep is very vital to reducing your workload later. If your target episode length is around 30 minutes, you want your episodes to hit 30 minutes. You shouldn't be having meandering 90-minute conversations with your guests. It's sort of disrespectful of their time because so much of it's going to get cut. And it's also a huge lift in the edit process. It's just more labor intensive. Let me just note here too, that if you are having rambling 90-minute conversations with your guests that go nowhere and just sort of meander everywhere, and you don't edit them, you've probably sacrificed the good circle that was at the top of the diagram. So prepping on the front can save you time in the end. This is a big one. So when you're thinking about frequency of what you might want your podcast to be, I'm going to encourage you not to be like, let's do this every week until who knows, until we all collapse, or for perpetuity. Consider a seasonal model. There are a few different advantages to this. First of all, you can take your time with all of those pre-production things, planning, outlining, scripting, editing. You're more likely to get the guests you really want because you have more time to like be flexible with them and get them when they're available. This way you can also produce, like fully produce all of your episodes before you launch your season. You could write your show notes, you could get your titles, you could do pretty much all of that stuff before you even launch. And that means that you can use that time during your publication, like during your season, to do the promotion. So you're not doing them all at once. That's going to decrease the number of hours per week you need to spend on your show. If you have guests that you think are going to be popular, like a really notable chef or something that's in your town that's been on TV network, you can decide when to place that. If you get them all in the can at the beginning, instead of being like, who are we going to talk to this week? Oh my gosh. Then you can be like, let's put him at the beginning so we hook a lot of people and hopefully keep them for the rest of the season. You can just be more intentional and strategic about the order and flow of your episodes. So when you think like at the end of this one, I can say, hey, since you enjoyed this conversation, stay tuned for next week. We're going to talk about this. Figure out what order makes sense. And it also sort of gives you some built-in excuses to build hype, because instead of a thing that happens all the time that people forget about and come back to, maybe they binge it on vacation, whatever, you now have little reasons to be like, it's our season finale. And hey, we're launching a brand new season. This is a chance for you to republicize the heck out of your show. It's a chance for you to be like, season 2 is coming next week. Make sure you're caught up on season 1 and make sure you're subscribed. It's a chance for you to re-pitch yourself for media interviews. Like, I'm launching a new season. You should have me on your talk show to talk about it. So in my opinion, a lot of advantages to seasonal, especially on small teams with small budgets. Another thing we can do to like, oh, we're not ready for success yet. I skipped something. Oh, we're going to repackage repeats. Okay. Once you've done like 20 episodes or so, you can start to package them as revisits, to allow yourself to take some time off, to give yourself some breathing space, to go on vacation, to sort of regroup if you need to. And that involves like recording a new intro and outro, going like, hey, today we're going to revisit our conversation about this. We'll be back with a new show next week. Maybe there's some sort of seasonal hook, like maybe it's hey, all the kids are going back to school, so we thought it would be great this week to revisit our conversation about childhood literacy. Here it is. The more episodes you make, then the deeper your archive is, and the more options you have for repackaging stuff. Stuff that's in the news, you might spark you to be like, hey, this big thing happened in our community. We thought it'd be good to reshare this conversation. All right, now we're ready for success. What does success look like? That's a huge question in podcasting and probably in everything. What would make you feel like your podcast is a success? Thinking about this helps you set realistic goals. So I'm interested if anybody's willing to unmute and like think ahead to this future dream world where you've launched this podcast and it's everything you hoped it would be a year later. What is it? What does that look like?
I would think that having people in the target audience contacting and making suggestions for future topics would be an indication of success.
Engagement. That is one of my favorite indicators of success.
Having super fans who listened to the podcast regularly, devotedly.
Yeah, having like your street team, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course there's numbers. That's one way to measure success. There's download numbers. Thinking about stuff like this is going to, one, keep you on track during like stressful times. And also you can schedule points in your process to check in on these goals, like your 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, a year, to see if your show is achieving the goals you set, but also to see if it's achieving surprising things that you maybe like even better. So like maybe your download numbers are not as high as you hope they would be, but maybe you've had 3 listeners hire you for consulting work. If that was maybe that wasn't your goal, but maybe that's like, oh, I didn't know this could function in this way. And actually it's great. So you might learn that there are other ways to measure success that you hadn't thought of to begin with. How you define success for it is up to you. There are plenty of people who make podcasts that are basically therapeutic for them. And they're like, this makes me feel better to sit down with, my sister every week and talk for 30 minutes about what happened in the news. We have fun. Nobody really listens to it, but it's serving its purpose for us because we always are in a great mood when we're done. Nobody gets to say what this is except you, unless you're being directed to do this by somebody above you in an organization, and then somebody else does get to say what success is. But since we're in like a dream fantasy world, we'll just remain defining our own success. Okay, I'm going to stop again for questions. Because then we've covered, like, what have we covered? Who, what, how, and why. It's a lot.
Laura, I have a couple of questions. This is Jim. And one is it possible as a small nonprofit that we have sort of like a pilot or a startup for this kind of idea of doing a podcast? So we've talked about as a committee that to make huge investments at this point without something proven, or to be able to at least start out with doing a couple of these to see if we can find an audience to have some measure of success, however we define it, views, downloads, etc. And then as a proof of concept that we then can go to the board and invest more from a budget perspective somewhere down the line. Is that a good model to follow?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. And this is tough because it's sort of a chicken and egg thing, I think. A lot of boards, if they're sort of not hip to what you're trying to do, will say, nobody's listening. You're making these and nobody's listening to them. And that's because there's no investment in marketing them yet. So you have to sort of learn how to tell that story of, you probably want to make some pilot episodes and then really solicit meaningful feedback from the people who are important to your mission and to your board. And that probably means like a lot of outreach and a lot of, hey, would you please just listen to this and just write some stuff down about it? Like calling in favors, putting it in your newsletter if they'll let you do that, like getting some meaningful feedback, not only because it'll help make your idea stronger and you'll see like what's landing and what's not, but also because then it's going to give you quotes for the next time you go to the board and say like, hey, this person said they've never seen themselves represented in a podcast before. They've never heard anything that represented their experience. And here's their quote about how meaningful it was. It's not going to be a bottom line-y persuasion. It's going to be a mission thing, because the bottom line's not going to come for a while. But also, if you sort of build that little, if you build that little pitch deck of the emotional mission-y stuff, then it can help your bottom line eventually, because that's also what you're going to share with potential donors and potential grantors. Like, hey, this is a thing you want to be part of. Look how meaningful it is to these people.
Thank you, Laura.
Of course.
I think there another aspect from the bottom line for me when you look at success metrics is, and I'm asking because in your experience, do you see this as a common result for United Way Next? Some of the things I think about is, can we recruit more new members in the various segments that we're focused on? Can we recruit new organizations, in this case, United Ways, to be members versus, as well as individual members who are alumni, retirees, et cetera, United Way staff? Is that unrealistic in the short term for us, and that we should focus a little bit on just finding our audience and providing a good product, at least initially?
I think you have to focus first on your content, because I think if you don't, then you risk getting into that area where you're making a show that's a commercial and it's not going to find an audience. You have to make something that people enjoy listening to, no matter whether it makes them join your organization or not. It has to be compelling enough for people to check it out. Otherwise, I don't know. I don't think it's going to reach people enough to have an impact on your membership numbers. So I definitely say put as many of your eggs as you can in the basket of making something compelling that people will enjoy listening to and come back to. And then, of course, like, we're going to sneak in messagey stuff, right? We're going to sneak in stuff about the great stuff we do and like how much we care about our communities. And we're going to sneak all this stuff in, but it has to be good storytelling and it has to be good conversations first.
Thank you, Laura.
Of course. Thank you for asking.
Laura,
Okay.
I see a couple hands raised. Barbara Edmond, I think you were next, and maybe Diane Levson was second.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask a question from a very novice point of view, because I don't listen to a lot of podcasts, but when I think about this, when we've talked about it, I think about it as another media format, and have thought about it as, which may be totally wrong, but we've had some really good programs before, but we don't really have any mechanism by which we could promote it and let somebody listen to it while they're walking around, while they're driving in a car. So for me, I actually look at it as a channel of being able to put something already recorded, which you have talked about, in a different media format, so it's more accessible to people on demand when they want it. Whereas what I'm hearing you say is it's a show. It's like, you're really trying to, it sounds kind of like a talk show kind of thing. And so I just wondered if you could comment on that. Is that a bad idea to use podcasting as a more accessible media tool?
I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea, but what kind of content are you thinking to repurpose into a podcast form?
We have a cadre of hour-long programs, some of them educational, some of them just informational, that, you know, something gets done and then it gets shelved because no one brings it back up, and there's no way for people to just listen to it or find it easier.
Yeah.
You know, and I akin it to some work I did, which is not in this media, but I did, and some of the folks know, I did some work on this Knowledge Cafe, which was a knowledge portal. And just because you put stuff in there doesn't mean people access it, but we created it, and then we made sure that we would keep promoting a new, you know, one of the things that was in there, like every day or a couple times a week. So, but it's different than, you know, it's actually using things for a dual purpose that have already been created as opposed to creating new ones. So just your thoughts on that.
I think that's actually a really good idea. Because you already have this stuff, right? And you've identified a problem that this could solve, right? The problem is it's not meeting people where they are. It's making them go try something new, which is going to this website that they might not be in the habit of going to find this stuff. Whereas they might already be opening up their podcast app in the morning to put something on while they make breakfast, right? So I think that repurposing stuff like that into a podcast feed is a great idea, but I think that you'll be more successful with it if you also sort of jazz it up a little bit. Like if you had an hour-long panel discussion, if you possibly have time to do this, rather than just plop it all in there and be like, hope they find it, hope they like it, maybe do some little narration that you can pop in. Take out the parts that didn't go anywhere. Take out the parts when somebody asked a question, it was off mic and you couldn't understand it. Like, and then record some narration maybe that's like, hey, we talked about this with these people. Here's why we chose these people. There was a really good part of the conversation about this, and then play that part and let the narrator be sort of like a tour guide through that long piece of audio, because as we've talked about several times already, people are doing something else while they're listening to these usually, and it's easy for them to tune out. It's so easy for people to tune out. And sometimes, depending on like sort of the how dense the material is, once they tune out, they might be lost. Like they could be totally lost. I'm sure you've had that experience where you're listening to something and you're like, I tuned out for 2 seconds and now I have no idea what they're talking about. So anything you can do to give your podcast listeners specifically some guideposts and like sort of take them by the hand and be like, now we're going to listen to this part because of this. And later on, we talked about this. Now we're going to take a little break, maybe put a music bed in to let you process some of that stuff. And now we're going to talk about this. Like, I think it's a great idea to repurpose that stuff in podcast form. And I think it can be even more successful if you give it like a tiny little bit more TLC, because it's also a good way to, like you said, make it more convenient for people to find. You can always find our stuff on iTunes. Just search for this title. You can always find our stuff on Spotify. Just search for this title. They're probably already using one anyway. It's a great question.
Could I trouble you to stop sharing your screen so people can see each other a little bit easier?
Oh, yes. Yes, of course. You don't want to sit here and look at the word success. This is like a mind trick where I'm playing on it. I'm like, success. Okay.
It's tattooed on my body someplace. Don't worry.
That's great. Sorry, I did not see that. I did not see that chat, but now I do because I'm not sharing my screen anymore. Okay, I think Diane has a question.
So Laura, this has been great. You've given me a lot of great perspective as we think about launching a podcast here. This question falls under the realm of lightening the load. So if, say, we were to launch a podcast and a number of us took on the role of serving as podcast hosts, do you think that that's a good idea, provided that we've got like the same intro, same format and all of that? And if so, how many is the ideal size, or how many is like the max number of hosts you might suggest with this?
So it sort of depends, right? Like, there is a program in our community called the Kentucky Author Forum, and their whole shtick is that a different person does the interview every time. And people love it. they get like a cool person to interview somebody and it makes sense, like the pairing of interviewee and interviewer makes sense. They've never had the same interviewer twice. So that's like one end of the spectrum. And then of course the other end is you sort of have a cult of personality around a host and people are coming back no matter what the topic and guest is because they like that host and they find them engaging. I think that somewhere in the middle can work just fine. I mean, if you have a team of 4 and you all do one a month, I think that works fine. Just, of course you're keeping in mind that like there's more to it than just being the host, right? There's more to it than just recording the copy and the script and doing the interview. But I think like as long as you're not centering your content around someone's personality, as long as your content stands on its own and you've done that prep work to make it interesting and you do that editing work to make sure the end product is interesting, I think you could do a regular rotation of hosts. And I think that's a good idea to lighten the load.
Thank you.
You might also end up finding that some of you all hate hosting. I've had that happen on teams before where they were like, we're all going to take turns. And then it turned out like some of them loved it and some of them absolutely hated it and ended up just wanting to do only behind the scenes stuff. So it's a cool way to sort of pilot each person as a host and see who really takes to it and see who the audience responds to.
I have a question around the cost of a typical podcast. And if you said this, I missed it, but I'm curious, like what exactly, like on a small scale, a good podcast, but it's still cheap. What would the equipment cost? What would be the expectation? Is it a way, just curious about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think thinking about equipment cost, unless you're in a very remote location, you're probably going to want to rent a studio space. You're not going to want to buy that stuff. Like you want to find a place near you. Some cities have like a maker space. Some cities will have like a recording studio in their public libraries, which is really cool. Sometimes you could partner with like a university that might have a recording studio. You don't want to buy all that equipment. Because what if it doesn't work? Like, what if you hate it? What if it doesn't land and you have to stop doing it? And that stuff you can probably negotiate. Like if there's a nonprofit, if there's a public radio station, you might be like, hey, can you let us use this? And we'll, thank you in the credits or something. We'll do it as a partnership. Your main expense is going to be people. It's going to be the hours of the people. There's like small expenses like your URL, stuff that you have for everything, your website hosting, your podcast hosting. If you want to pay for like really in-depth analytics so you can see a lot of information about your listeners, all that stuff is small. The big cost is people and time.
Great, thank you.
And speaking of time, I think we're about out of time. So I'm going to drop a worksheet in the chat. Oh, can somebody share this with Jim? Because he had to leave.
Yes, we will.
Okay. This is not going to let me do it because I'm not the host. Okay, let me send it to Caitlin real quick.
And as a follow-up, we can send out the worksheet to everybody who participated today, as well as anyone who might be listening in for the next workshop.
That would be awesome. Thank you for doing that. So this is like going to be a bunch of questions for you to think through. No right or wrong answers, but you are going to bring them to the next session. We're going to sort of help you workshop your ideas, see like where we think you're on the right track and where we're not. And then we're going to talk about like how to actually do the thing. So that's pretty exciting. Thank you all for all of your questions. Thank you for doing my polls and thank you for unmuting and taking part in this conversation. And I can't wait to see you next time and talk more about your ideas and how we can make them happen.
Thank you, Laura. It's been very helpful.
Really terrific.
Thank you.
And just remind everybody that the follow-up session is Wednesday, November 1st from 2 to 3 o'clock. So if you haven't signed up and just have it, and Laura hasn't scared you away, please go ahead and sign up, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next time.
Thanks, y'all. I'm gonna send this. I'm gonna send this worksheet over to Caitlin so she can send it.
Great. Thank you, Laura, so much.
Thank
We've
you,
had a
Laura.
great day. Thanks to everybody for joining. It was so good to see everyone, and make it a great week, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Bye.